This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Michael's just finishing a research fellowship here over the last 6 months. He's a professor from Montreal?
University of Windsor.
University of Windsor. And he's co-investigator for the Visible City Project at Archive. And his research focuses on practice of media and art in a variety of urban contexts. He's published on the intersections of media and digital technologies, theatre and performance, language and voice, sound and translation. And has recently co-edited Cartographies of Place, an interdisciplinary collection that situates different historical and methodological curves in urban media studies. And he's titled today's presentation, Nostalgia for the Future City, Transforming Detroit, Windsor. So,
Great. Well, thank you for two very stimulating talks this afternoon. I'm very excited about the dialogue that we can have afterwards. I'm not from Detroit, and so I'm always a little bit wary of talking about Detroit, but I live opposite Detroit. I can see Detroit from my kitchen window in Windsor, and so that outsider perspective does frame, to some degree, my analysis that I'm presenting today. In 2010, after nearly 5 decades of decline, driven by the compounded forces of deindustrialization from the 1950s onward, suburban sprawl, and of course distressed race relations, Detroit's then Mayor David Byng launched the so-called Detroit Future City Strategic Framework Project. This was specifically designated a strategic framework rather than a master plan, which I think is actually quite interesting. It was an ambitious effort. It took 3 years to complete after thousands of public consultations, sometimes fraught, attempts to engage citizens in the debate about Detroit's future. It produced a 354-page book, you can download it if you like, and concludes that there is a future in Detroit, that there is a strategic plan to stabilize the population by the year 2030, double the number of jobs in the city of Detroit, and of course, essentially to create an integrated transit system to become a city for all. As you will know, this plan, ambitious as it is, and I think actually quite an interesting proposal coming from a city government that was in distress, and is still being used as a guideline to this day, did not prevent Detroit from facing bankruptcy in the year 2013, or 2014, I should say. Now, this is not the first time in Detroit's history that a plan for the future has been implemented. In fact, it's quite a recurrent theme. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the famous Doxiadis Associates, in conjunction with the Detroit Edison Company and Wayne State University, undertook a 5-year, $3 million study of the urban Detroit region. Konstantinos Doxiadis, you may well know, was the founder of the so-called ecologists movement in Greece in the 60s and 70s, which was defined as the science of human settlements, and would write a number of interesting books that would be appropriate for this series today, including Between Dystopia and Utopia, which grounds theories of utopian society very much in sort of the writings of Patrick Geddes and Lewis Mumford, etc. So this would be a very interesting point of connection with some talks this morning. But this project was a macro planning project, which regarded Detroit as belonging to a multi-pronged megalopolis stretching between Chicago, Cleveland, Toronto, and even Montreal in Canada. Notably, and as you can see here, this is the plan for central Detroit. What is usually blotted out in maps like this is Windsor in Canada, which is down here, which arguably are part of a greater urban environment surrounding Detroit. And the master plan for the greater Detroit area would place Detroit interestingly, with Windsor, but also create a second urban region up closer to the border with Canada, just south of Lake Huron. But very often the Canadian-US border disappears in this study as an impediment to regional urban development. Its major recommendation was the development of a twin-centered urban structure between downtown Detroit and Port Huron, as you see here in this picture, at the border with the city of Sarnia, Ontario. Sadly, it's all too apparent today that this massive project was based on a false problematic. The question posed was, how can an additional 7 million people be most effectively accommodated in the urban Detroit area between 1972 and the year 2000? Today, with a city population of fewer than 700,000 and a greater urban population of the greater Detroit of some perhaps 4 million inhabitants, Detroit is popularly characterized as a shrinking city, a ruined city, a city in stasis. These popular characterizations, I want to argue, are challenged, though, by the image of Detroit as a generative matrix of innovation, design, and of course creativity, embedded in our sense of Detroit as a network of scenes, cultural scenes, musical scenes, and artistic scenes which reach back quite far. I believe that these kinds of projects and a series of creative collectives working on both sides of the border at this moment, and in fact reaching back to the 1980s, so a period that falls between the two studies that I've presented so far, work against the kind of compelling images of Detroit, and by association Windsor, as hollowed out urban environments. So I want to characterize a series of artistic projects jointly as a kind of cultural scene, which I believe is a particularly fertile concept in order to understand their collective response to the nostalgic yearning of ruin gazers and the recurrent rhetoric of building and rebuilding Detroit's future city, to which Windsor is forever an intimate onlooker. By demanding, of course, a kind of participatory aesthetics and a gradual or incremental form of transformation. In the wake of the 2008-2009 financial recession, the many symbolic roles of Detroit that Detroit occupies, the heart of industrial innovation, the arsenal of democracy, as it was called, of course, after World War II, a mecca for techno enthusiasts, an icon of urban decline, were eulogized in dozens of newspaper headlines, weekly features, urban arts blogs, and glossy new histories of the motor city. Detroit is metonymic, of course, for the auto industry in its ineluctable decline in the United States, as well as for vital or authentic urban cultural scenes. Its image hovers between that of a city in perpetual ruin and a petri dish of cultural experimentation, which has largely operated outside prevailing market forces since the financial downturn. As Detroit edged ever closer to municipal bankruptcy, which was finally declared in July 2013, following the state appointment of an emergency financial manager, it captured the attention of international media as a city whose enigmatic past and current state of destitution rivaled perhaps only pre- and post-war Berlin. If this romantic comparison overlooks serious distinctions between such cities, notably the history of racial tensions in Detroit and other northern industrial cities, it has contributed nonetheless to a steady stream of writings seeking to map the cultural terrain of the American metropolis in ruins. Time magazine, among others, launched a one-year assignment Detroit project in September 2009 after editors bought a house where they were embedded reporters. Articles in the New York Times and other major publications consistently describe the ruined city as a fecund field of cultural production, using terms, for example, such as attracted by cheap space and driven by a sense of civic responsibility, young artists are turning crumbling homes into art centers, converting factories into studio and exhibition spaces, and planting community gardens as artworks. Now, while art scenes have long been associated with the aesthetic of a bohemian lifestyle, deriving in particular from the material conditions of cities with depressed economies, Detroit's contemporary art scene is extolled in these kinds of writings as largely detached from the international circuit of art commodities in global markets. Detroit is different, as the above comments suggest, because a wide range of art makers and cultural creators live and work outside conventional notions of private and public property, and moreover, are civically engaged in ways specific to Detroit, which resist easy exploitation. In a series of blogs, for example, Vince Carducci has theorized the conditions of Detroit's contemporary creative cultures, suggesting that the cartography of artistic initiatives is best understood as deriving from the art of the commons, and following Jacques Rancière, consisting of an aesthetic community. Art of the commons results from the breakdown in distinctions between private and public property, while the conception of aesthetic community isn't defined by the network of producers so much as by the conscious collective of ideas they are making tangible. These different accounts portray Detroit's art scene as intensely localized, contained essentially within the city's physical boundaries, and oriented to shared understandings of civic engagement that exist outside the logic of the market economy, which has so dramatically failed the city. As you can see, that's the Detroit River. So once again, Windsor's downtown is largely blotted out by the headline here. But Detroit, as I will talk about in a minute, all too often forgets that it is in fact a border city. This pervasive emphasis on Detroit's internal dynamics also serves to overshadow its location directly on the Canadian international border and as a major player in the North American Free Trade Agreement trade corridor. Few cultural commentators are curious about this geography, past or present. A generation of auto industry decline in Detroit seems to have eradicated any historical sense of the origins of the city as le Détroit, the narrows of the Detroit River. Across the Canada-US border, Windsor, Ontario, is a city of some 200,000 residents, and its neighboring suburbs have all developed and declined alongside Detroit's colonial and industrial histories. In many ways, Detroit-Windsor is a simultaneously integrated and divided urban environment in which patterns of cross-border circulation and impermeability are integral to each city's character. Conditions neglected or merely footnoted, especially in the many histories of Detroit's racial, economic, and infrastructural struggles. Cross-border connections mark these cities in ways that distinguish them from the globalized flows of people, materials, and information that regularly pass through them. The Ambassador Bridge in my university is located right here, for example, accounts for some 60%, I believe, of Canadian-US trade, with some 8,000 to 10,000 lorries crossing every day. While artists have long drawn upon these cross-border affinities, a multi-layered Detroit-Windsor creative scene has become evident to me in an array of creators and collectives that all strive to counter the cheap aestheticization of empty industrial spaces and structures through site-specific initiatives, incremental urban transformation, and neighborhood stabilization programs. Prior to 9/11, the international border between Canada and the United States was relatively open. Today it appears to be ever thickening for people, even as cross-border trade is ever more urgently promoted. While Detroit has witnessed revitalization and gentrification in parts of its center, few benefits have trickled down from these hip urban enclaves to neighboring acres of abandoned factories, buildings, and storefronts, rundown residences, and vacant lots. Windsor, long classified as Canada's Detroit, albeit less dramatically ruined, also began promoting a new downtown cultural district and a university arts campus starting in 2011. It too is nonetheless dotted with empty storefronts and boarded up structures. Images of dense urban sociability are reduced in Detroit to a few blocks of tourist destinations in the Corktown, Greektown, Midtown, and Sugar Hill districts, with a Saturday morning Eastern market. And at Windsor to a number of downtown streets that for decades have been oriented to hospitality industries, bars, and clubs especially, as a draw for young Americans. If urban scenic life only takes shape as part of the trend towards so-called creative cities, alongside urban density and the availability of amenities, then Detroit and Windsor would be largely devoid of any kind of cultural scenes. Yet scenes, I would argue, are deeply ingrained in their imaginaries. Certainly in Detroit with musical scenes including Motown, metal, techno, and hip-hop, but also historically in cross-border patterns of mobility, people, labor, and goods. Consider, for example, the cases of the Underground Railroad, prohibition smuggling, or early 20th century cross-border labor movements. The narrative of Detroit as a city of ruins provides a peculiar backdrop to creative initiatives. Ruined Detroit produces an aura of stasis through which the city is characterized either as dramatic or an open canvas. And this stage-like atmosphere is often interpreted as a space for nostalgia, recalling and replaying Detroit's golden era of Fordist prosperity. But it also generates discussion about cultural initiatives that place Detroit on the path to urban renewal and sustainability. Site-specific urban experiments have taken form within this distinct ruined landscape of the city. These projects may be considered scenic when they collectively circulate understandings of Detroit's conditions and broadcast an expanding narrative of Detroit as a model city in which creative endeavors prefigure ambitious forms of urban transformation. For Windsorites, however, Detroit forever looms. The panorama of the Detroit skyline beckons to Windsor, and in turn, Windsor bears witness to Detroit from the position of an observation post, a lookout connected to, yet separated from, the economic forces and even racial tensions that engulf its larger neighbor. An observation post closely linked to the vast Detroit canvas. Through the integration of Detroit's imaginary into Windsor's sense of self, the border operates less as a boundary and more as an interval or point of resonance. When it comes to Detroit, Windsorites are a particular brand of urban spectator. They are not idle, but rather, I would argue, intimate onlookers. The border's many spaces and forms of circulation yield creative energies that work against the overwhelming sense of stasis associated with abandoned landscapes and ruins. Within Windsor, a creative community strives to work as an intermediary between Windsor and Detroit. Numerous Windsor-based artists have embraced Detroit's famed Cass Corridor scene of the 1960s and 70s, a period of artistic fomentation that took place in the district south of Wayne State University. And Windsor's art site, one of Canada's first artist-run collectives and an early Windsor Detroit institution to pay an artist fee, has often reflected the depth of involvement of Windsor's creative community with Detroit, represented, for example, in the 1986 retrospective Borderlands Art from the Arch. Today, in Detroit, projects such as the well-established Heidelberg Project, and more recently, Powerhouse Projections, the Unreal Estate Agency, and Arts for Detroit, among others, all work through incremental, contemplative urban interventions to counter states of dereliction and to urge neighborhood stabilization. And in Windsor, the Green Corridor Project, the Broken City Lab, and the Border Bookmobile will serve as my case studies to consider how they've reacted to Detroit's experimental cultural activity by reconceptualizing various border spaces as places equally open to transformation. Now, a year before the bankruptcy in 2013, amidst the turmoil, two separate editors asked me to identify what kind of cultural scenes exist in Detroit today, and if Detroit's cultural activity affects the city of Windsor directly across the border. Still new to the area, I was intrigued by the idea of a cross-border art scene, and the idea that cultural scenes themselves are closely tied to our characterizations of particular cities. In the early 2000s, I had participated in a 5-year study of the culture of 4 cities, Montreal, Toronto, Dublin, and Berlin, which sought to develop cross-comparative frameworks to examine the specificity of these cities' cultures. It was in many ways a Mumfordian kind of project, asking how do cities retain their distinctiveness in an age of global and transnational cultural flows. One area of cross-disciplinary interest that emerged from this Cultural Cities project was the notion of an urban cultural scene. Alan Blum, a project researcher, suggested that scenes are recurrences envisioned as master categories that organize the very description of the city. The gay scene, the music scene, the drug scene, the art scene, the tango scene, the rave scene. Here, he argued, it sounds as if scenes, like commodities, circulate in ways that might bring them to some cities rather than others, or to all cities in varying degrees. Yet scenes are also integral to the sense of specificity that we associate with particular urban enclaves. Or as Blum would further argue, if the scene points to a recurring feature of all cities, or of any city worth its name, imagine a city that could not claim any cities. then this universal function is distributed differently. Seeing resonates with some concerted activity, an activity to a degree specialized, at least differentiated, but not necessarily covert. For him, the ambiguity of the urban scene is marked by a series of tensions that he unpacks as the grammar of scenes. What we think of as a scene, which is after all a fairly murky concept, is characterized by the tension between its regularity and its ephemerality. How often it takes place, but also the idea that it is fleeting. The commitment of its practitioners on one hand, and the casual engagement of visiting yet idle onlookers on the other. Then there's a tension between its length of integration in, between its level of integration in, or its removal from the city. When are scenes only part of a city? And when do they become indistinguishable from what we know of a city? And finally, the tension between the scene's coming to be and its perishing. The idea that the scene always contemplates the possibility of its own mortality. Will Straw, another project researcher, noted that scenes may be distinguished according to their location, the genre of cultural production which gives them coherence, a musical style, for example, as in references to the electroclash scene, or the loosely defined social activity around which they take shape, as with urban outdoor chess playing scenes. Scene invites us to map the territory of the city in new ways, while at the same time designating certain kinds of activity whose relationship to territory is not easily discerned. In both of these accounts, the theatricality of city life is a central feature of the scene. Or in Straw's words, the city's capacity to generate images of people occupying public space in attractive ways, and the sense of effervescence and display, which are long-standing features of an urban aesthetic. Blum would argue, we need to ask after the implicit sense of collectivization, integral to the scene, and how it conjures up a conception of collective behavior. In other words, to participate fully in a scene means that our own act of seeing, visualizing or watching the scene, has to be also witnessed. We do seeing and are seen seeing at the scene. It was a lovely formulation. A scene, I think Blum would also argue, as it gathered strength, makes those who are idle and detached appear out of place. This reminds us that a scene is always a project, he says, and as such makes the encounter with place a test for all those who fall under its spell. And these notions, the visibility of being seen and doing seeing, and the scene as a kind of project, a collective project, are fundamental to what I wish to describe as cross-border scene of life in Detroit, Windsor. For they allow us to identify the emplacement, on the one hand, of onlookers within Detroit, and on the other hand, of Windsorites as intimate onlookers between the two cities. George Steinmetz has described the ruins of Detroit as eliciting a particular form of Fordist nostalgia. Once again, here's the famous Packard plant, which became a haven for raves in the 80s and 90s. A particular form of Fordist nostalgia that constantly invites spectacular and dramatic representation, conjuring up hollow comparisons with ancient ruins. For instance, ruin photographer Camilo Jose Vergara famously suggested that Detroit place a moratorium on the raising of skyscrapers in order to establish a segment of downtown as an American metropolis. And New York Times travel writer Brian Park equated Detroit's ruins with those in Greece or Italy. Detroit's once mighty structures, he wrote, can exude a dilapidated wonder. Most dramatic is the former Michigan Central Depot, its 18 blown-out floors looming against the sky, its railroad station interior looking like an abandoned Roman settlement. More recently, French photographers Yves Marchand and Romain Meth attempted to document the city of ruins as a contemporary Pompeii. And again, I'm showing some pictures from a New York Times article, which are quite dramatic, taken from the air. Ruined Detroit is conjured up as a vast stage on which primarily white suburbanites trace the storied histories of the Fordist metropolis in its golden age, physically by automobile or through a variety of websites and books which offer guided tours and ruin maps. For Steinmetz, suburban ex-Detroiters' fascination with the ruined city is nostalgic rather than, as with other communities grappling with ruined environments, melancholic. Detroit's Fordist past is an object for historical contemplation, and the texts, films, and tours that resurrect Fordist Detroit are unambiguous about the fact that this prosperous city is located firmly in the past. Nostalgia for Fordism, writes Steinmetz, is a desire to relive the past, to re-experience the bustling metropolis as it is remembered or has been described. As Lee Rodney also writes, ruin porn, as it's sometimes called, simultaneously offends and appeals as we see something of ourselves in the theatricalized extreme scenarios pictured in the glossy, large format photographs. But an alternative sense of the city's creative scene is emerging against the backdrop provided by such theatricalized accounts of Detroit as a scene of ruins. In the famous Victorian Brush Park district. In contrast to the image of Detroit as a stagnant stage for ruin exploration, urban interventions by artists with both local and international roots, some supported, others contested by local communities, attempt to engage with the city as a site of change, where empty spaces are characterized by constant movement, the circulation of waste and abandoned artifacts, and the gradual transformation of the built environment's material character, either by the process of decay or by intervention. By highlighting the transformational character of ruins and inviting spectators to be visible as engaged participants, the projects I'm about to describe dislocate the commonplace narrative of Detroit's cultural implosion, shifting our attention to the ways in which we might reconstruct disconnected stories and individual lived experiences whose traces are discernible only in fragments. One such project was the so-called Unreal Estate project. In his Unreal Estate Guide to Detroit from 2012, architectural theorist Andrew Herscher has compiled a directory of creative projects emerging from Detroit's property of crisis in the guise of a tourist guidebook. Unreal estate, he writes, is urban territory that has fallen out of the literal economy, the economy of the market, and thereby becomes available to different systems of value, whether cultural, social, political, or otherwise. According to Herscher, Detroit's unreal estate urbanism has inspired many of its inhabitants to rethink their relationship to the city and to each other. Inhabitants whose socioeconomic status in many instances falls outside the purview of an imagined creative class associated with dense clusters of urban amenities. As a compendium of local initiatives, some undertaken by choice and others by necessity, Herscher's Unreal Estate Guide itself supposes a scene of unreal estate development that includes creative survival as well as cultural critique, and it includes the ephemeral aesthetic servicing of those supposedly in need, as well as material responses to objective needs through long-term self-organization. But Detroit's primary site-specific venture that seeks vitality in ruins is the famous Heidelberg Project, initiated by artist Tyree Guyton in 1986. Over nearly 3 decades, Guyton has adapted and appropriated abandoned properties along a block of Heidelberg Street in his childhood neighborhood on Detroit's east side. Heidelberg is a curious amalgam of artifacts, both made and found, that Guyton has assembled out of the detritus that circulates through the neighborhood. Houses, cars, trees, and streetscapes are decorated with colored polka dots. By imposing patterns of regularity to the display of decaying stuffed animals, rotary telephones, shoes, vacuum cleaners, tires, and other objects of everyday urban life, Guyton's project is a kind of Brechtian defamiliarization of what was conventionally perceived to be mere rubbish. The Heidelberg Project has appropriated both objects and adjacent properties, opening a debate with the city about its status as art form or squatting. Partly in response to community anger over the project's transformation of the site, the city of Detroit has twice endeavored to demolish the project, in 1991 and again in 1999. To his credit, Guyton fought these attempts and in the early 2000s, I suppose, won the court case to provide a freedom of expression clause, which is posted around the site. In 2013 and 2014, a number of the project's main houses burned down in apparent acts of arson, a frequent occurrence in Detroit. But if the Heidelberg Project is representative of Detroit's site-specific cultural scene, we glimpse here the scene's capacity not only to reflect upon its own mortality, but also to extend itself into the narrative of city life as a whole. As an article in the Detroit Free Press declared, the art, like Detroit, will survive. Heidelberg's focus on neighborhood stabilization is often compared with powerhouse projections. A collective on the edge of the city of Hamtramck, which is a standalone municipality within Detroit's greater urban area. This project has also won international acclaim. Initiated by artists Gina Rykwert and Mitch Cope, who together previously established the collective Design 99, the project is centered on the renovation of one particular property, the so-called powerhouse, but has expanded in recent years to a number of neighboring houses and spaces. Hamtramck is a more densely populated and diverse district, including a substantial Bangladeshi population, with comparatively more affluent residents than Heidelberg's east side, but has nonetheless experienced its share of abandonment, criminality, and vandalism. Cope is an artist by training, and Rykwert, an architect and designer, bought the powerhouse for $1,900 American dollars in 2008, and soon purchased adjacent lots that were valued even less. Renovated with solar and wind power, the powerhouse represents a self-sustainable urban enclave, aiming to power adjacent properties itself, as well as a process of neighborhood empowerment through participatory action. While Cope and Rykwert do not hail from the area, unlike Guyton, who grew up on Heidelberg Street, they nonetheless envisage the project as equally invested in the neighborhood. As the powerhouse has transformed into Powerhouse Productions, an artist-run, neighborhood-based, non-profit organization funded through grants from local and national foundations, nearby houses have been purchased and transformed into, proposed as, a series of concept houses, such as the Sound House, the Skate House, the Play House, my favorite, the Squash House, the Jar House Office and Guest Home, and the Ride and Sculpture Park, a skate park where you ride the art. All these concepts aim to increase neighborhood participation through meetings and performance spaces for community members and youth. In each of these instantiations of the project, slow and considered architectural processes are at stake, focused on sustainable activity and resourced through local and found materials. The powerhouse unfolds as a kind of living architecture in which contemplative process resists and counters the demand for efficiency and haste in a housing market that so badly failed at the height of the 2008 financial crisis. If the Heidelberg Project and Powerhouse Productions each instantiate a project in the theory of scenes, of living and surviving in Detroit, they diverge from another initiative that received widespread media attention, the so-called Ice House, a proposal to encase an abandoned Detroit house in ice. Undertaken in 2010 as a commentary on the housing crisis, the Ice House appeared to some to be another venture by artists who appear in Detroit ready to take advantage of the open canvas. But instead, the project recalled rather than criticized the aestheticizing tendencies of so-called ruin porn, which, as John Leary has lamented, dramatizes spaces, but never seeks out the people that inhabit and transform them. As one Detroiter remarks in Mark Benelli's book, Detroit City is the Place to Be, people don't understand how offensive urban exploration is to us. Just the arrogance of it. What do you think would happen if 4 black kids went into one of those buildings? They'd be arrested. White kids, all right, go home, son. Freezing houses. Detroit isn't some kind of abstract art project. It's real for people. These are real memories. Every one of these houses has a story. Ultimately, the Ice House was little oriented to participation in the sense of being seen or doing seeing. In contrast, I would argue Powerhouse Productions, which draws a considerable international audience and hosts a regular visiting artist program, is committed to neighborhood participation and espouses the desire to be seen and seen. The Heidelberg Project and Powerhouse embrace the idea of a scenic project as an assemblage of devalued local spaces, found materials, a DIY mentality, and continual neighborhood participation. Now, with the borders changing character, the rise of free trade, especially in the 1990s, and the increasing implementation of more stringent border security in the 2000s, have all contributed to the transformation of Windsor on the edge of Detroit's border, from local points of contact to corridors of global trade, favoring flows of products constantly with the people. Stricter identification requirements, passports or enhanced ID cards are now demand introduced to the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative in 2009. And they've not only slowed down cross-border tourism, but have also blocked the passage of undocumented people who might well contribute to local labor markets on both sides of the border. And while economic linkages to the automotive sector have long defined the cities and neighboring regions, political cooperation between local authorities has always been curiously distant. Thus, there's a peculiar condition of economic interpenetration between Detroit and Windsor, but political separation, which contributes, I think, to the cultural landscape of the Detroit-Windsor borderlands. Perhaps as a response to this political disjuncture between the municipalities, it is not surprising that there are many instances of cross-border cultural activity. The three Windsor projects I want to discuss briefly: the Green Corridor Project, the Broken City Lab, and the Border Book Memorial, work to bridge the border by fostering cross-border recognition of the ways in which Windsor's own urban predicament complements Detroit. Border spaces in Windsor have become an arena for experimentation in which artists and art students work with and against the urban environment. The Green Corridor Project was initiated in 2004 by artists Noel Hardin and Rod Strickland, a University of Windsor visual arts professor. This project sought to reclaim 2 kilometers of the Windsor-Detroit Gateway along Huron Church Road, approaching the Ambassador Bridge. In its various manifestations, as both an undergraduate course and an urban research forum, Green Corridor has challenged the fragmentation of the border environment into seemingly disconnected spaces. The Ambassador Bridge's vast customs and security zone focused on cycles of trade and travel, industrial zones, and surrounding communities with a high proportion of low-income residents, and also the campus of the University of Windsor itself. The area includes the adjacent blocks of a street called Indian Road, a street of now boarded up houses owned by the American Ambassador Bridge Company as part of its bid to create a twin span, for which Windsor City's Council has listed as a designated heritage area. As I previously argued, Green Corridor challenges us to rethink the urban spaces of the border in terms of circulation, rather than the linear metaphors of corridors and crossings. The project engages the border environment as a fluid space, open to innovations in urban design, and in so doing shifts the spatial bias of the border from an edge to an environment or a field. The complexity of Detroit and its material conditions are not external to this field, but rather are necessarily part of an expanded understanding of borderline spaces as points of resonance. In 2009, for example, Green Corridor staged an open corridor intervention, an interactive and site-specific festival of arts, science, performance, and community. This is an installation by a very well-known Canadian conceptual artist named Ian Baxter. Designed as a drive-through open-air gallery along the Huron Church Road running south of the Ambassador Bridge, Open Corridor staged public art projects and performances to engage both local and international travelers, especially lorry drivers, in seeing and listening. In keeping with Windsor's bid to be seen, seeing, the border space was thus momentarily redefined and recoded as an experience of the local rather than a transnational passageway. Much like Detroit's Heidelberg and Powerhouse productions projects, Green Corridor is motivated by the same logic of gradual and contemplated transformation, drawing our attention to the integrated material conditions of Detroit Windsor and the challenges posed by living and working in places that are in critical condition. This practice of urban self-reflection is furthered by the Broken City Lab, an artist-led creative research collective working to promote civic change by acknowledging and disrupting Windsor's state of crisis. Initiated by a local artist named Justin Langlot as a research creation project for his MFA, the Broken City Lab includes a number of student artists with backgrounds in various fields. It has undertaken a range of urban interventions, environmental awareness and self-help slogans for Windsorites, for example, biodegradable seed-filled balloons emblazoned with "You Are Worth It" for the Open Corridor Festival. As with Green Corridor, the Broken City Lab calls for new ways of mapping Windsor in relation to its own past, articulating a need to create a foundation upon which new border relations can be imagined and enacted in both Windsor and Detroit. Broken City Lab's success in obtaining a variety of arts funding has allowed it to pursue activities ranging from pop-up urban interventions, local workshops, and international conferences, as well as artist residencies dealing with neighborhood stabilization. I'm going to jump ahead just one page. In their 2011 online and self-published compendium, How to Forget the Border Completely, the Broken City Lab extended an earlier project called Cross-Border Communication as a series of interventions based on the desperate need, as they would say, to communicate with Detroit, Michigan from Windsor, Ontario. In this endeavor, the desire of Windsorites to be seen looking at Detroit is manifested. In its first manifestation, cross-border communication projected messages such as "We're in this together" onto buildings facing Detroit at the Riverside intersection of Windsor's Main Street. How to Forget the Border Completely documents a series of imagined interpenetrations between Windsor and Detroit, such as the disappearance of the Detroit River, or cross-border subways and portals, and a whole series of other imagined forms of integration between the cities, in quite a playful manner. Actively forgetting the border for the Broken City Lab is an attempt to imagine the impossible, a projection of an unattainable future vantage point from which we may nonetheless contemplate the present moment. Forgetting for the Broken City Lab is thus a tactic to counter nostalgic ruin gazing in the region as a whole, and the passivity of observing these cities as merely objects of historical contemplation. Finally, Lee Rodney's Border Bookmobile project takes up questions of instituted versus tactical forgetting of the region's historical configurations through an archive of artifacts and stories that highlight changing attitudes toward the border cities. The Border Bookmobile is an art research project organized and curated by Rodney, a scholar of urban and visual cultures at Windsor, who also leads a senior undergraduate seminar on border culture. Since 2009, the Bookmobile has been housed in the 1993 Plymouth minivan, an emblem of Detroit design made in Windsor's own Chrysler minivan assembly plant. Drawing on Detroit's neglect of its border as a starting point, Rodney describes the project as a mobile exhibition of books, photographs, maps, and ephemera of the border region, as well as U.S.-Mexico border relations, a memory project that seeks to chart a changing relationship between Detroit and Windsor as border cities, by inviting viewers and participants to produce new narratives about the region that speak to the interrelationship between Windsor and Detroit. In its most recent manifestation as a public archive and reading room, the mobile library was turned inside out, allowing visitors to browse the plethora of materials and border memorabilia. As with Green Corridor and the Broken City Lab, the Bookmobile highlights the border's capacity to facilitate flows of products while often hindering flows of people. By reifying the otherwise abstract border into specific visual spaces on which to project acts of resistance to the borderland's fragmented character, the Green Corridor, the Broken City Lab, and the Border Bookmobile all draw attention to strategies for reimagining abandoned structures and underused spaces bound together by the Detroit-Windsor Gateway. If each initiative appears staunchly local in orientation, their joint commitment to imagining a different cross-border urban experience is part of the SEAMS project. As Rodney puts it, if Detroit and Windsor prove to be resistant to gentrification, it is not merely because of the blue-collar legacy, it is because the critical issue facing neighborhoods is stabilization. These initiatives are simultaneously connected to and separate from Detroit's aesthetic community, a community which thus exceeds its own perceived local boundaries. In conclusion, against each city's hurry to embed scenic life within officially demarcated cultural districts and economies, the projects I have described are all oriented to cautious and considered transformation, grounded in dialogue, workshops, research, and planning. The sense of intimacy fostered within efforts to stabilize Detroit neighborhoods is complemented by forms of intimacy between Windsor and Detroit, generated through Windsor-based projects that address forms of urban crisis, all deeply linked to Detroit's future. Windsor art collectives thus enter into a dialogue with site-specific projects in Detroit as both insiders and onlookers, not in the sense of idle onlookers, as with most ruined tourists, but rather as an audience expressing its deep knowledge and appreciation of Detroit's history. current conditions. In the gradual nature of transformation that these projects espouse, as they contemplate a perhaps unattainable future, the scene is afforded time to contemplate its coming to be and its potential perishing. Thank you.